we've known in neuroscience for a long time that there are a lot of different mechanisms in the brain that seem to be relatively independent of one another. One can continue working while another's not working properly. And you could say we've known this for more than 100 years. But what we haven't had a good understanding of is just what these separate mechanisms are and what it is that they're specialized for. And there have been sort of two ways to think about what these mechanisms might be specialized for. One view advocates sort of what people have called domain-specific mechanisms. And by this, people mean, well, there's information processing mechanisms in the brain, and they're really specialized for processing a particular type of information out there in the world. So an example of this would be a mechanism that's specialized for processing faces, or a mechanism that's specialized for processing speech. And this has been contrasted with another view called the domain general view. And the domain general view suggests, well, it's not that the mechanisms are specialized for processing a particular type of information. They're specialized just for a particular processing task, and that processing task operates over a wide range of stimuli in the world. So example, this might be an all-purpose recognition mechanism. Maybe it operates on faces, it operates on objects, it operates on places and all kinds of things. Or a sort of general-purpose reasoning mechanism that you use for all kinds of different reasoning tasks. One of the best ways, there's a lot of different ways one can go about getting evidence to try to understand what it is a mechanism is specialized for. But one of the most powerful methods that we have in neuroscience is neuropsychology. And in neuropsychology, you use dissociations between different abilities in people who either have brain damage or some sort of developmental anomaly to try to make inferences about what these mechanisms are. And so what I'm going to focus on today here is looking at a dissociation between faces and other types of object recognition, and using that to try to understand how to try to get a better feel for what it is the mechanisms are specialized for that we use to recognize faces. And so this condition is called prosopagnosia, and it was really long considered an extremely rare condition. When I first got into this field, maybe 7 years ago now, there had been a number of cases that had been published discussing people who, let's say, that had a stroke or they had some sort of brain damage, and then this left them unable to recognize faces. But there'd been maybe only 5 or 6 cases reported of people who'd had this condition their entire life. So they just never developed normal face recognition abilities. And so we've got 2 different types, acquired and developmental, both of which were thought to be really rare. But I sort of stumbled into this during grad school and just started doing the research on my own. And I created a website to talk about the work that I was doing. And during grad school, I started being contacted maybe every week, every couple weeks by somebody who says, that sounds like what I have. And occasionally I'd get to go out and test them if they were in California where I was during grad school. But then I got to Harvard here, and we created a website, a little more elaborate, that had a bunch of questions on it about their conditions and things like that. And we started hearing from a lot of people, and now we've heard, in the last 4 years, we've heard from, now it's up to like 450 people, actually. So what people thought was an extremely rare condition appears to be, actually there's a lot of people out there. We still don't have a good feel for how many are out there, but it seems to be much more common than we thought. And one of the things we've discovered is that, probably 90–95% of the people who contact us are actually developmental cases. So it's not that they had a stroke or not that they were in a car accident or anything like that. It's just that they never developed face recognition abilities to the levels that you and I have them. Just to give you a feel for what it's like, I've got a couple quotes here. So this first person says, while traveling, I had a stopover at O'Hare, and I was approached by a stranger in the lounge area. It took 10 to 15 seconds of casual conversation before realizing who it was. It was my brother. So what I'm trying to get across here is it's not the occasional, everybody misses a face every once in a while. And nobody can remember names after all. But this is really something different here. And this is a woman who I test who's out in Southern California. And she says, I think prosopagnosia has worsened my current depression if it's not the root cause of it. This condition always affects my ability to form normal social links to others. I prefer to be a recluse because I can't confidently function in any other way. My avoidance of people to interact with socially is nearly phobic. And with this, I'm just trying to get across sort of the the social aspects of it. Not surprisingly, having trouble with faces really causes a lot of these people lots of trouble. Though a fair amount of them seem to get through life fairly well. I mean, a lot of them are fairly successful career-wise. Yeah.
Is it true? I had heard that people who have this disease can eventually make some connections. So, like for example, people like who've been married for 50 years or whatever eventually do gain the ability to recognize their spouse or
right.
like their mom or something like that. Is that true?
I find that, let's say I give somebody a famous face test. 95% of the people are going to be able to recognize Bill Clinton. They just feel, that some of them say, it took me a few years, but after a while, yeah, I could recognize him then, So it's a really different process than what you and I go through. But eventually they can often come to recognize some faces. It's not clear that they're doing it in the same fashion that you and I are, but they're often able to recognize them.
How about the first statement about the brother?
Yeah. What about it? You mean why couldn't he recognize him?
He obviously no one longer than like Bill Clinton.
Sure. I suspect that a lot of it has to do with context there, that he wasn't expecting to see his brother. But I don't know, Now what I'm going to be focusing on here today is trying to understand how to best characterize the mechanism that's not working in these people. And over the years, there have been a lot of different proposals for how to best characterize that mechanism. The first one up there is the domain-specific hypothesis, and that says, well, this mechanism is probably specialized just for faces and not for processing other types of objects. Whereas the other 6 all suggest that the mechanism processes faces, but it also processes other types of objects as well. Now, in the past, when people have argued for a particular account here as as the best way to account for a prosopagnosic problems, what they've typically done is they've tested 1, maybe 2 of these explanations, and then concluded that, well, it's not either of these explanations because our data is inconsistent with that. Therefore, it must be explanation X, whatever happens to be their favorite explanation, and then they go on and argue for that. And when I first got into this a number of years ago, I saw that was a kind of weak way to argue, and so what I decided to do was try to really test all the different explanations in individual patients so that we could really get a good feel. If you don't test them all, you don't really know which one is the best explanation. And so what I'm going to do is go through and test them all. And this is what people used to do. They'd test 1. What I'll try to do is go test them all and see if the face-specific explanation really is the best account. The way I'm going to be able to test them is they all make different predictions about what sorts of object recognition should be impaired along with face recognition. And so we'll see if those predictions are borne out. Okay, so we're going to do this with 2 people, one of whom is a developmental prosopagnosic, one of whom is an acquired prosopagnosic. And the developmental prosopagnosic is a guy named Edward, and he's a 53-year-old guy, smart guy. He's got PhDs in both physics and theology. He was aware of his problems with faces as a child. He recalls, for example, being unable to recognize his father in a lot of situations. He's not aware of any head trauma that might have caused this. And we did an MRI of his brain, so we got to look at his structural neuroanatomy, and we couldn't see any lesions. There's no reason to believe that he had any damage that caused this. Now, Edward's got a general face processing impairment. I'm going to focus today on face recognition, but he also has problems, say, reading the emotional expressions of people around him. He's got problems determining gender from the face. When we have a task where we ask people to sort faces in terms of attractiveness from least to most. If I gave these cards to most people sort them in a pretty consistent fashion. I mean, not surprisingly, that's why everybody on TV looks the same. But if we ask Edward to do this, his sorts just really bear no resemblance to the way that normal people would do this. So this is a general problem that he's got. And he doesn't think he's got any problems with object recognition. And he also doesn't have any navigational difficulties. I mentioned that because about a quarter of the people who contact us having face recognition problems also tell us that they've got really severe navigational problems. So they have trouble just understanding the layout of their neighborhood and things like that. Now, the acquired prosopagnosic is a kid named LJ. He's 17 now. And he'd had normal face recognition as he was growing up. And then he had a really strange incident at a school dance. He was posing for a photograph, and the anti-red eye light flashed, and then the flash went, and he was immediately disoriented by this. And he was disoriented, and the music that was playing at the dance didn't sound meaningful to him any longer. So he stepped out of the dance to just try to clear his head. Pretty quickly, the disorientation went away, and his hearing came back to normal. But then when he looked at the person who he was with, he didn't have any idea whether he knew that person or not. And this was in November of last year. And as far as we can tell, there hasn't been any change at all in terms of his ability to recognize faces. He's about one of the most densely prosopagnosic people I've ever seen. And so we're still not, we really don't have any ideas about what it is that's causing it. We've ruled out a few things. But anyway, so he's got this strange thing. And as I said, there's not any head trauma that could have caused this. He'd had a few episodes prior to the school dance over the previous few years in which he'd been disoriented for long periods of time, say a day or something. One time even, he and his mom went and saw a neurologist to ask him about this. The neurologist didn't know what to make of it. And in one of these cases, it was after seeing a strobing light, so it was quite similar to what was going on at the school dance. Now, not surprisingly, LJ feels he feels lonely in this world because it's not just face recognition either, it's emotions, it's attractiveness, all these different things. He says he feels really lonely. It's kind of an alien world that he lives in. He's walked down the hall of his high school and he just doesn't know who anybody is, doesn't know sort of what their emotions are. And he's got a problem beginning with face detection. And what I mean by that is he has problems seeing a stimulus as a face even. So these are Arcimboldo paintings. Arcimboldo was this weird Italian painter who for some reason liked painting faces composed of objects. And so he'll paint this face that you and I all see immediately. Or if I show you this fruit and vegetable face there, you and I see the face in there immediately. We show these to LJ. You say, do you see the face in there? He'll look at it for a long period of time. He doesn't see it. He sees the objects perfectly well, but he doesn't see the faces. Yeah?
Lots of times I know epileptic patients have problems with strobe light. Is there any connection you think here?
Yeah, that was certainly our first thought when we heard that. And he went on Tegretol, which is an anticonvulsant, and actually he's still on it. And it hasn't done anything in the 4 or 5 months. There's also, his EEG was normal, though there was some thought that some of the areas involved with face recognition are so deep in that the EEG might not pick up those signals. But we don't have any reason to believe at this point that it's epileptic. Okay, so LJ's object recognition is normal as far as he can tell. He thought for a while that his navigational skills were deteriorating, but we're not so sure about that now. And as I said, all the structural scans and that have been done with him and the EEG have all been normal so far. And he's one way we sort of keep track of sort of that he's still with it. He's a world champion juggler, and at this point he's just as good as he ever was. He actually, since this incident at the school dance, he won his age group, 16 or 17, whatever, at some, I don't know, national, international type level. So he's still with it in terms. Okay, just to give you a feel for their face recognition, this is just a famous face test. So we show people 25 famous faces. Maybe some of these people, their 15 minutes of fame is up, but we show them 20. Controls are able to name nearly all these. Edward was only able to name 3 of them. He was able to name Michael Jackson. I kind of stupidly, I left the little strands of hair there, and that helped him. And then he recognized Reagan and Martin Luther King. He thought possibly just because he'd seen those images so many times. Yeah?
When you say you left the strands of hair, is that suggesting that hair helps identify?
Yeah.
Is that not part of the facial recognition?
It definitely helps them identify, and there's pretty good evidence from a guy who's got sort of the reverse problem that these guys have. He's good with faces but can't recognize objects at all. And when you cut the faces out, he can recognize them just as well as you and I. Then if you show the external part of the face, he's really terrible with them, whereas you and I can often figure out who people are using the hair and things like that, suggesting that his face recognition system works, the hair goes to the object recognition system, which doesn't work. Yeah?
What about in terms of we said the
figuring out emotion from facial movement or whatever. What about body movements and the way someone would carry themselves? Sometimes you can recognize someone just by the way they walk down a hallway or
Yep.
footfalls and so forth. Is that going to be is that for the object or the facial?
It might even be neither. It might be something else entirely. But prosopagnosics often use, people's bodies to recognize them and their gait, the way they move. Yeah, and we've run a few people on. There's something called biological motion where you take a bunch of dots. You put reflect mirrors or something that catch the light. People walk in a dark room. We've run a few prosopagnosics with that, and they're fine with it as far as we can tell. I heard Donny Osmond. There's no Donny Osmond up here.
Who's that for Clint?
Oh, that's Jim Carrey.
Oh,
Yeah.
you see his face.
Okay, here's LJ. We showed him 32 famous faces, and he was only able to name one of these. Strangely enough, it was Nicolas Cage. He really knows pop culture really well, and he stared at it for a long time, and then he's kind of like, I think it's Nicolas Cage. And he was using the eyebrows. I don't know.
Is there a reason you showed him different ones than?
I didn't show him the first one because I was saving that, hoping that when I first tested him on this stuff, I thought he was going to get better in a week. Like I flew out there 3 days after finding out about him. And so I thought I'll run him on the test that I showed you already after he gets better to show that he's better again. So it's just, there's not a principled reason sort of thing. Okay, over the last 10 years or so, there's been a lot of evidence suggesting that faces are recognized in a particular part of the brain, and this has come from functional MRI. And functional MRI is a way to measure activity in the brain. So you'll have a person looking at faces, you measure how active their brain is and where it's active. You have somebody look at objects and you measure where their brain is most active. Then you can compare those two. If you find some areas that are especially responsive to faces, when you substitute away that object activity, that's been used to argue, well, that area is especially involved with face recognition. Of course, you want to use other sources to help you really make that inference, like you look at people who have lesions in that particular area and things like that. But there's a lot of good evidence that there are a couple areas that are especially responsive to faces. And so we wanted to look at this with Edward and LJ. And so we looked with a number of different object classes. And so here's a control brain. These areas that you see here, these are flipped. So the left is right, right is left. And these areas that you see in yellow and orange are the areas that are especially responsive to faces in normal subjects. If we look at Edward, you see very little there. You see a couple blips, but those were just artifacts due to actually one of them, the face response was stronger than the object response, but both were negative. And the other one was just a spike. So he didn't show us any face selective voxels at all, which we've scanned a lot of normals. We don't ever see this. At first, people would see subjects that had no face selective voxels, but now that we know what we're doing, we just don't see that. But then we take a look at LJ, and we see he's got a perfectly normal response. This image is a little screwed up. It should be about half of what you're seeing there, but he showed a normal response. We were really surprised by that because from what we could tell in terms of behavioral testing, LJ's problems started even before Edward's because LJ has problems with face detection, just seeing a face as a face. Yet there's his FFA, perfectly normal. And there are a couple other areas in extrastriate cortex which respond more strongly to certain object categories than others. And one of these is an area that responds more strongly to places. So we wanted to take a look to see if Edward and LJ showed this stronger response to places as normal subjects do. And they both do. It's not like their face response, or at least not like Edward's face response. He shows a normal response to places. And they also both show what's called the EBA, the extrastriate body area, which is the area that responds more strongly to human bodies. So it appears to be, for Edward anyway, face-specific. So we wanted to look a little more closely at that area that responds more strongly to faces, which is called the FFA, which just stands for fusiform face area. So we wanted to focus just on that. Now, in a normal subject, let's say we show somebody two faces. When we show that second face, let's say the response is, I'm just making it up, but it's a 1.2% signal change compared to how much that part of the brain is responding when you're not showing it a face. So it's just up a little bit more. Well, if I showed the same face twice in a row, the brain, when shown that second face, doesn't respond quite as strongly. It's as if the brain sort of, it's a little bored by that. I've seen that before, and so it doesn't respond quite as strongly. Now, we wanted to see if LJ would show that same lessening of response when he sees the same face twice in a row. And what we found was, so these black columns here are all control subjects. And so what this shows you is how much less their response is when they've seen the same face twice compared to when they've seen two different faces. So this person's a real outlier. Their response when they saw the same face twice was only 20% of their normal response. But then for everybody else, you can see it range between 60 and 90%. So for all of them, they were responding just a little bit less when they saw the same face twice in a row. What we see with LJ is he's right at 1. So it appeared that his FFA just wasn't discriminating at all between faces that he'd seen before and faces that he hadn't seen before, whereas for normals it was. So this was the first physiological evidence we actually had that sort of something was different here in LJ's brain. Now to get back to what I started off with, before I laid out on a slide all the different explanations for prosopagnosia and sort of what it is that's impaired in these people. And what I've got here, I've got all the different explanations again here on the left. But what I want to get across with this slide, and I'm not going to talk about the specific explanations at this point, but what I want to get across is that each one of these different explanations makes a different prediction about what should be impaired along with faces. Now if we look at this first one here, the one that says, well, it's a mechanism that's specialized just for upright faces. Well, that only makes one prediction. Prosopagnosics are going to be impaired with faces. So that's not one you can easily test. In contrast, all the other ones predict that prosopagnosics should have impairments with other types of objects like they do with faces. And so what I'm going to do is go through and test these predictions and see if, in fact, Edward and LJ do show the predicted impairments. So the first explanation says that the problem in prosopagnosia is with a mechanism that people say, well, it's for within-class recognition. And what people mean by that is recognizing a particular face, a particular house, a particular dog, and so on. So anytime you need to do individual level recognition. And so we looked at this with a wide range of stimulus classes. And we used the same paradigm in all these cases. So we'd show them, let's say, 10 faces. They'd try to memorize them. And then they would have to discriminate those 10 faces from a set of 30 faces that they hadn't seen before. So they're just saying, yeah, I've seen that before. No, I haven't seen that before. So what this figure is going to show you is how many standard deviations below the mean Edward and LJ are with the different categories. Now, just to orient you, in neuropsychology, people typically say performance 2 standard deviations or lower than the mean is impaired performance. And so what that means is you're in the bottom 5% approximately. So we see here, this is Edward here in red. You see he's about 9 standard deviations below the mean. So he's just, he's just doing terribly on this. Now, the within-class explanation predicts he's also going to show impairments with non-face stimulus classes when we test him on those. And yet what we see is that he's doing just fine on this. This is the mean here. And so you can see he's just around the mean. In some cases, he's a little better than the control subjects. In other cases, he's a little worse than the control subjects. But we don't see anything like what we find here with faces. When we take a look at LJ, we see that his scores are even further dissociated. So he's even worse with faces than Edward is, and yet he's doing just fine on all these non-face stimulus classes. So this just gives you a feel for how they do compared to each control subject. So each column here is what A prime is a measure of discrimination. The higher your A prime is, the better you're doing. I've got LJ there. I actually had to make that up because he was below chance, but we'll put that there. And then that's Edward. Then you see all the control subjects here doing quite well in the test. So you can really see they're really different. Here, what I've done is I've sorted all the subjects from the best or worst score to the best score. And you can see that their 2 colored columns there are really, they're right in the mix there. They're doing just fine on all these tasks. This is just response time. They were really slow with the faces. They had normal response times with the objects. So it wasn't that they were taking a long time to make their responses to objects. Okay, the data that I just showed you with the different object classes also bears on 2 of the other hypotheses that I want to address. And one is this idea that Well, the problem in prosopagnosia is with a mechanism that's used to recognize non-decomposable objects. And what people mean by non-decomposable objects are objects which are difficult to break into parts. The argument goes, well, if an object's difficult to break into parts, it may require some sort of holistic strategy where you recognize the entire thing at the same time without actually breaking it into its different parts. It's sort of a nebulous hypothesis, but that's what they said anyway, so I tested it. Unfortunately, the person who first proposed this hypothesis didn't say what object classes other than faces would count as non-decomposable objects, but we can take a guess here. The horses and the cars seem at least as non-decomposable as the faces, and yet they were perfectly normal with faces or with horses and cars. We're going to come back and test this more directly a little later. Another idea out there is that the problem in prosopagnosia is with a problem with representing curved surfaces. So faces have a lot of curved surfaces. If the problem was simply with some mechanism for representing any sort of object that has curved surfaces, you'd be bad with faces. But it's also predicted you'd be bad with other objects that have curved surfaces. And so in a recent paper arguing for this, they used dogs, glasses, and cars as their objects that had a lot of curved surfaces. And yet we see that our subjects are doing quite well with objects that have curved surfaces, horses, guns, cars, and glasses. And we'll come back a little later again and test this more directly. There's a lot of evidence that faces, upright faces anyway, are processed in a different fashion than we process most other types of objects. And the way people have tried to characterize this, they say, well, we use some sort of configural processing on it. What people mean by that is that the specific sort of precise distances between the different parts of the face, say the eyes, say the distance between the nose and the mouth, that these are represented in a more precise fashion in faces than other types of objects' parts are. And now, if you had something like this, it could be a face-specific mechanism that does this configural representation. But it also could just be a general-purpose mechanism that does that, which it's applied to faces. Maybe it's applied to some other classes as well. And the second explanation is the configural processing explanation. It says, yeah, it's anytime you have to apply configural processing to something, you're going to be, a prosopagnosia is going to be bad with it. And so we wanted to look at this and compare how Edward and LJ did with faces in terms of configural processing and how they do with another stimulus class. And so we used a paradigm that's become popular over the last few years with faces, in which the way this task works is it's the same different task. So we present a face, remove it from the screen, present a second one, and then you simply have to say, are those two faces the same or different? Now, half the trials are going to be same, but on the different trials, there's two different types of different trials. On the top row there, you see faces that differ in terms of their parts. So we've changed the eyes, and we've changed the mouth in those faces. So the only type of information telling you that those faces are different from one another is the feature information or the part information. In contrast, down in this row here, we've got different spacing between the parts, yet the parts are remaining the same. So we've manipulated the distance between the eyes and the two eyes. We've manipulated the distance between the nose and the mouth. Yeah?
Just a quick question. The faces in that your first idea with the non-decomposables, you said that's stuff that can't be broken down into parts.
Right.
And yet here we're breaking faces down.
I find it strange that hypothesis says we can't break faces into parts, because everybody knows what face parts are, but that's the idea behind it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm not the only one.
Yeah.
I have a question that you might want to answer in a minute, but my question is, after they go through this, I don't know how they did because we haven't gotten to it, but if you tell them that, okay, look at the mouth, it's different, then can they see a difference or not?
They often can do better if you really tell them to focus on particular things. I mean, if you tell them just look at the mouth, they're liable to miss other things, of course. But so it's a trade-off. Mm-hmm. But when we don't tell either the controls or the prosopagnosics sort of how they should go about doing it. So anyway, we've got these two different types of different trials. We did the same thing here with houses. Now with houses, so we're manipulating the windows and the door here in the top in terms of the parts. Down below, you see we're changing the spacing of those windows and doors. Now, what this plot shows you here is these are all the control subjects. This is Edward, this is LJ. This is percent correct on the part changes here on the x-axis, percent correct on the spacing changes on the y-axis. What you can see is we've got nice separation here between Edward and LJ and the control subjects for both parts and spacing. Now, that's not particularly surprising. We know they're terrible with faces. So what's interesting then is how do they do with houses? And here you can see they're doing fine. They're clustering right up there with the control subjects, and Edward's doing really well with them. And so it looks like it's not just a problem with any sorts of objects where you need to do this configural processing. It seems to be configural processing specific to faces. Okay. Now next we're going to take a look at upright and inverted faces. And for more than 30 years, inverted faces have served as kind of a great control class for upright faces. And this is, of course, they're the same in all ways as upright faces, except for their orientation. And so I think just looking here at this, you get a feel for the difference in your perception between upright and inverted faces. It's just tougher to tell, but that's Elvis. I mean, you saw him on the right probably first. But, and that's why I was showing you those title slides that I had going around when you were coming into the room, just to give you a feel for the difference in your perception of those faces. That Thatcher illusion that you saw is really a famous demonstration of the difference in your perception of upright and inverted faces. You just don't see the grotesqueness of it when it's inverted. But what inverted faces are going to allow us to do is test the predictions of the two of these hypotheses quite directly. The first is the non-decomposable hypothesis. And so if upright faces are non-decomposable, inverted faces also must be non-decomposable. And so if the problem is the non-decomposability of the stimulus, the prosopagnosia is going to be bad with the inverted faces as well. And similarly, if it's the curvature of the upright face that's causing their problems with them, well, they should have problems with inverted faces as well, because those have just as much curvature. So what we did for this task is a real simple face matching task. You're presented with a frontal shot of a face for 400 milliseconds. It's removed from the screen. Then you're presented with 2 3/4 profiles for a little more than a second. You just have to say which one of those two guys is the guy that you're seeing there on the left. This is probably pretty easy. It's the guy on the right. But when you invert them, you can see it becomes much more difficult, especially if they're flashing by you. So here's our control data. This is percent correct for upright. So you can see there's something like 86% correct. Percent correct for inverted is 68 or 69. And so this is a real typical face inversion effect. We get a nice drop off. When we take a look at Edward, though, we see a really different pattern. We see that Edward's just as good with the upright faces as he is with the inverted faces. His performance with the upright faces is about 3.5 standard deviations below the control mean. So he's really bad with upright faces. But he was within 1 standard deviation of the control mean for the inverted faces. So he's doing normally with those. And if we take a look at LJ, we see the third possible pattern, actually. So LJ is actually even, he's better with inverted faces than he is with upright faces. And we've tested him with this task now a lot. And he's always better with the always better with the inverted faces than he is with the upright faces.
Is he always better than the control?
He's not. This is 1 standard deviation above the mean, so there's nothing real funny. As we continued testing him, though, on this, he got pretty damn good at it. I mean, he's a real smart kid, and he figures out how to do these things. Now, this pattern, actually, LJ's pattern, has been seen in 2 other cases before. And if we think about the etiology of these 2 cases, it makes sense, the pattern that we're seeing in these 2 guys. So Edward is a developmental prosopagnosic, and so what appears to be the problem with him is he just never developed those special processing abilities that you and I have to process upright faces. And so he processes upright and inverted in the exact same fashion. And we've tested him on this again. He continues to score the same for upright and inverted. So he just processes those upright faces in the same way you and I process inverted faces. That's the only thing that developed for him.
And LJ already learned it.
Yeah, LJ had the mechanism there, but now it's broken. And yet he continues to send representations of upright faces to that broken mechanism. And so he actually does worse with those upright faces than the inverted faces. I mean, it's clear he could do better if he just route those representations of upright faces to this processor that he's using on the inverted faces.
When you do that, does he have the upright face? Does he see the upright face and the one that's inverted at the same time? So you can make a comparison?
No, they're only presented, it's just presented, you're either presented with an upright face or else presented with an inverted face.
But not at the same time.
They're not present at the same time, no. Okay, Okay, so of course, this is inconsistent with the non-decomposable hypothesis and the curvature hypothesis, because they're doing normally with these inverted faces. Okay, the hypothesis, or the explanation of prosopagnosia, which is probably maybe the leading contender, it's certainly got a lot of press over the last few years and a lot of money they've gotten, is this idea that faces are recognized by an expert mechanism that you use with anything you become an expert with. So you and I spend a lot of time looking at faces throughout our life, and so we become really good with them. The idea goes, it's not just faces that use this mechanism, but anything that you become an expert with. So if you're a bird watcher, you're going to process birds with the same mechanism that you use to process faces. If you're a dog show judge, you're going to process dogs with this mechanism too. So it's anything that you become an expert with. Now, there's sort of two different varieties of the expertise explanation, and I've been calling one the rapid expertise explanation. And what this says is that expertise with a stimulus class can be developed really quickly, say in a matter of a week, if you just do a lot of trials looking at a stimulus class. A little later, I'm going to talk about what's called the extended expertise explanation, which says expertise takes on the order of years to develop. So they're on two different time scales. But this idea that expertise can be developed rapidly has been tested a lot with these sort of funny, kind of lewd stimuli here called the greebles. And what people do in these experiments is they are presented with these greebles. The greebles are given a name. They just have to remember the name that goes with each greeble. And they do this for 8 sessions. And by the end, they're really good naming the greebles. And they're also, each greeble belongs to a family. So there are 5 different families. There's going to be a total of 20 greebles they learn. Anyway, so what we want to do is look and see, can Edward and LJ learn to learn these greebles just like other people can? Or are they impaired, which is what the rapid expertise explanation predicts. Yeah.
Who chooses the names, and are the names connected at all with how they look?
Carrie chose the names back there, but no association at all. We didn't want to give them any sort of hints or anything like that. We just made up some dumb names so that they could press. Each name had to start with a different first letter, so that they could each press on the keyboard. Anyway, so the predictions are Edward and LJ aren't going to be able to develop expertise with these greebles because, well, Edward hasn't been able to develop expertise with faces for 53 years, and LJ's lost his expertise. So we test them. You don't really care about the details, but there's 2 different types of trials that we use to test them with. Test their knowledge of the greebles. In one, a label's presented, and then a greeble's presented. You have to say whether they're consistent with one another. Is that really Triz, for example? So if that was Triz, you'd say, yeah, that's Triz. If you're presented with the label Triz, and then you're presented with a greeble that's not Triz, you simply say no. And then also just naming ones. These are real straightforward. Presented with a greeble, you have to press the letter key corresponding to the first letter of their name. So here are our control subjects. Because Edward and LJ are so different in age, we had 2 different control groups. One, some undergraduate controls, and those are the filled symbols there. And then we had some middle-age controls. Edward's 53, so we had people right around his age. Those are the open symbols. What you see here, these are the naming trials here where you have to name the greeble. And all our controls doing quite well. 2 of the middle-aged controls are having a little more trouble with this. But many of them are doing just as well as those undergraduates. And what this is just percent correct here on the y-axis. And we scaled the percent correct. In the first session, because they'd only learned 5 greebles, we made the best that they could do 25% correct, because at this point they'd only learned a quarter of the greebles. And so we wanted to reflect the learning that was going on here. And so we scaled the percent correct. Anyway, so these are the control subjects. And if we take a look at Edward and LJ, well, let me just give you the predictions for what the rapid expertise explanation says. It says that Edward and LJ are going to do just as well as the controls in the first few sessions. And that's because in the first few sessions, the control subjects haven't developed expertise with the stimulus class. They're just sort of getting used to it. But what we should see is that the controls and Edward and LJ should progressively split off from each other, because the controls, as the training goes on, are developing expertise with the greebles. But what we see, in fact, is that both of them are doing really well on this task. They're not having any trouble with the greebles. And so, at least in terms of naming, they're doing fine. These are just their response times, and their response times were right in among all the control subjects. These are the verification trials where you see a label, say Brad, and then you see my face. You have to say whether they're consistent or not. Again, we scaled the percent correct just to reflect how many greebles were known. And again, you see they're doing quite well on this. And their RTs are in the normal range as well. And then the last one are family verification, where you see a label, you see a greeble, you have to say whether it's in that particular family. And again, they're not having any trouble with this at all. And so the results are clearly inconsistent with the hypothesis. They're also inconsistent with the within-class explanation and the curvature hypothesis. The greeble task you had to do within-class recognition, so recognize a particular greeble. And the greebles, of course, they have a lot of curved surfaces, and so it was inconsistent with that hypothesis as well. And then just lastly, I told you there's two different versions of the expertise explanation. One that says expertise can be developed in a week or two. Another that says, no, it takes more on the order of years to develop. People have looked at extended expertise with dog show judges and bird watchers. Unfortunately, Edward and LJ are neither dog show judges or bird watchers. But what we did was we looked at, there's been accumulating evidence that human bodies are processed in an expert fashion, that people are quite a bit better with upright bodies than they are with inverted bodies. And of course, that's what they've seen a lot, upright bodies. And so we wanted to take a look with Edward and LJ to see if they would show impairments with human bodies, which is what the extended expertise explanation would predict. And so this was just, we presented them with a face task where they see a face and they see two faces next to it. They've always changed their the pose a little bit. And we did the same thing with human bodies. So we present an upright body like this, and then we present two bodies that are turned slightly. So like the face task, the orientation has changed a bit in this. And so what you're discriminating here is sort of just the proportions of the bodies. It's quite similar to faces in that it's a shape task. So not surprisingly, Edward and LJ did really bad with faces. So they're about 3 standard deviations below the mean with faces. But what we see with bodies is they're doing really well on this. They're not having any trouble. They're actually scoring a little bit better than the control mean. So the results are inconsistent with the extended expertise explanation. And so just to sum up quickly here, I made this slide. So what this has got is all the different explanations for prosopagnosia that say that it's not a face-specific mechanism that's impaired. And along the top there, I've got all the different tests that I've presented data from here. And I put an X each time there was data that's inconsistent with that hypothesis. And so what you can see is we found data that's inconsistent with all the different explanations of prosopagnosia in both Edward and LJ. And so it appears that, at least in their case, the face-specific explanation is the best account of their impairment. And so here's where we are with them. We've ruled out all those. Now just to summarize here quickly what I think is going on in face recognition. When a normal subject recognizes an inverted face, you process that inverted face with some sort of general purpose mechanism. It doesn't have the special sort of processes that are tailored for upright faces, and so we're just not all that good at it. In contrast, this mechanism is the same one that we use to process other types of objects as well. In contrast, when you are presented with an upright face, you process that upright face with some sort of face-specific mechanism. But in Edward and LJ's case, that mechanism, of course, is not working. In Edward, it just never developed. In LJ, it's been broken by brain damage of some sort. And so for Edward, since he never developed those face-specific mechanisms, he processes that upright face via this general purpose mechanism. And that's why he does the same with upright and inverted faces. In contrast, LJ still got that mechanism there, and he continues to send information about upright faces to it. And because it's broken, he actually does worse with those upright faces than he does with the inverted faces. And this data is really nicely consistent with a very interesting case, which I briefly mentioned earlier, this guy, Mr. CK. And this isn't my case, but Mr. CK is a guy who really just can't recognize objects at all. I don't just mean recognizing individual objects like, oh, that's my car versus that's not my car. You show him a glass, a drinking glass, he might not even know that that's a drinking glass. He's just got really terrible object recognition. He's functionally blind in terms of going through life, and yet he can recognize faces perfectly normally. So he can recognize these two faces without any difficulty. This is the guy who's done all the research with him, Morris Moscovich. But then if we presented him with a bunch of objects, he wouldn't be able to recognize these objects. And he also, interestingly, wouldn't be able to process the inverted faces either. His performance just plummets when you present him with inverted faces. And I don't mean plummet the way ours does. I mean, he just can't recognize them when they're inverted any longer. And so this really suggests that these faces are processed by a special mechanism, whereas objects and everything else seem to be processed by something else. And so just in closing, I started off the talk talking about the two different contrasting ideas about what it is that mechanisms are specialized for. Are they specialized for processing information about a particular stimulus class, or are they just specialized for a processing task, and they operate over a wide range of stimulus classes? And this data certainly suggests that at least some mechanisms are specialized for processing particular types of information. And we'll skip this. Oh, and then just lastly, thinking about development here for a sec, Edward never developed face-specific mechanisms, and yet both the behavioral data that we've got from him and his fMRI suggest that he's got perfectly normal object recognition mechanisms. And so this tells us that, face and object recognition are not only functionally dissociable from one another, but they appear to be developmentally dissociable from one another. And so this suggests that some sort of scheme like this, in adults, if we've got separate mechanisms for different types of classes, say faces, objects, and places, well, it appears, we know that they can dissociate from one another, but it also appears that developmentally they can dissociate from one another, suggesting that there are different developmental mechanisms which give rise to these different mechanisms that we see in adults. So they're built by, at least by developmental processes, at least in part, are a little bit different. Okay, so that's it. Yes?
Edward's case, do you suppose that's a genetic basis that
We don't know. He tells us that his sister told us that she had some face perception problems when she was in high school, when she was in stressful situations, but she doesn't notice any problems now. Probably about a quarter of the people who contact us tell us that they've got genetic relatives who have problems recognizing faces. And so it certainly appears to be the case that can be a cause.
On the same lines, and maybe some of those subjects are, I guess I'm stuck with the idea of all those objects and how similar they are in some cases. Why can't we then use that general processing to recognize faces as well? Have possibly some people learned to connect to that mechanism instead? I just wonder why they haven't compensated, I guess.
Well, I'd guess they probably have compensated in some cases, but that compensation still doesn't get them to where you and I are with this, who have this mechanism that's really specialized for processing just that particular stimulus class. It's got these sort of tailor-made procedures that allow you to recognize upright faces better than you would recognize upright faces with some sort of general purpose mechanism. That's my best guess, but we don't know much about the development of these mechanisms. Yeah?
In some patients undergoing, say, brain surgery, they're shown pictures of, say, an object like a shoe, part of the brain has been put to sleep, so to speak, for the surgery. Oftentimes, it seems that they need to have both sides of the brain working in order to completely identify. In other words, they might say, seeing a picture of the shoe, well, it's leather, without identifying the quality of the object, without really recognizing the object itself. Now, what you said about the face-specific mechanisms sort of implies perhaps that that's not the case, or is it? In other words, are both sides of the brain working in the identification and recognition of faces? the way they are objects, or does it seem to be just
Right.
different?
So what you're talking about with objects there is I show you a shoe. Some of the information you're using to recognize that shoe is the texture maybe of the surface. So you say, oh, that's leather. And then there's another part of your brain that's analyzing the shape of the object. And okay. Face, it's not clear exactly how faces are done. I mean, there's no doubt there's a number of different types of information about the face. So, we talked about the features of the face, talked about the spacing of those features. One thing that I'm hoping to look at soon is just simply the pigmentation of the face. So all these three things you see, anytime that people process inverted faces, you see that they're much worse with these three different aspects of faces, suggesting that all three of them are processed in some special fashion in upright faces. Now, they might very well be processed in different parts of the brain, and then you bring them together somewhere. So you can imagine that one cause of prosopagnosia could simply be that integration of that information, so what you're talking about. So we don't know enough at this point to say how it works exactly and whether there's different parts of the brain that analyze it. But my bet is that it's going to be different neurons that analyze these different types of information, because it's hard to represent two different types of information in the same neuron at the same time. Yeah?
When you're talking about face recognition and you're showing different pictures, is it what they're seeing? Are they seeing all the same face, or they're just seeing the face? But
So how does it look to them?
yeah,
That's a good question.
and would they, if I took a picture of three people, would they be able, and 6 different pictures of 3 people, would they be able to pick that picture is those 3 people, or do
Right.
all the faces look the same?
Often, we've just recently developed a test actually to look and try to look at the differences between face perception and face memory. So in the face perception test, we present a face and we present a bunch of faces. They're all there. You can look at them all at the same time. Let's say I gave somebody 4 different faces and they were 4 different people. They had to match them with one person up above. Well, if they can look at them all at the same time, they could probably do that without a problem. Now, I'm not saying they're processing it in the same way you and I are, but they're really smart about saying, look at that eyebrow, look at that eyebrow. That's the same person. Now, that's not face recognition, really, in the same way that you and I just grab the face and we recognize it. So I think what they see, in some cases, they just don't see them the same way you and I do. In other cases, they probably see them the same way you and I do, but they just can't store that in memory like you and I do. So there's probably different explanations for different people. Yeah.
As I get older, I will see certain movie stars or actors or whatever on TV, and I recognize that person. I recognize them being in a certain movie, but I cannot for the life of me remember their name. When you're showing pictures of those faces to LJ,
Right.
is he, number one, familiar enough with those faces? And number two, is it the fact that he can't recognize the face, or he can't remember their name?
Right. We always want to check up to make sure that these people are actually familiar with the, if you can't recognize somebody if you haven't seen them, it's pretty difficult. So what we did after the test with LJ was we simply asked him about his familiarity with these people. And, I'd say a name and he'd be hitting himself in the head saying, how could I not recognize, because he'd seen her so many times, or him. And so he certainly knew these people. And he's very into, like I said, he's very into pop culture. So he's quite well aware of who these people were. And it wasn't just naming them either, because they can give us any information. If I'm showing you Abe Lincoln, and I don't need the person to give me Abe Lincoln. They can say president during the Civil War, and I'll give them credit for the item. So, they also aren't telling me, oh, I know that person, but I just can't think of who it is. So they don't even get that sense of familiarity that you and I get.
I was just wondering if you did any studies in regards to how faces change, like through aging, and if there's any recognition that way. I mean, the example that pops to my head is like Drew Barrymore in E.T. versus Drew Barrymore now. Like, we can take a look at her and say, oh, that's definitely the same person. Have you done any look into stuff like that?
I haven't done that. Nobody's done anything like that with the prosopagnosics, and there really hasn't even been all that much work done with normal face recognition. The other professor in my lab did a study probably 20 years ago. It's kind of a fun study where they got high school yearbook photos, and then they got current photos, and they asked people to try to match these people up, and people were really pretty bad at it. But they could do it to a certain degree. And if you knew the people, let's say you were in the high school class with those people, then people were pretty good at it. Actually, it seems they developed what people call robust representations of those faces. But it's an interesting question, which we just don't know that much about right now. Yeah.
Have you tested more than just these two subjects? Do you have more?
Oh yeah.
And lots more people.
Yeah, I probably tested 50 or 60 over the last couple of years. So.
Really consistent.
It's not all beautiful like this. But what we actually find is lots of prosopagnosics have trouble with object recognition as well. And so in neuropsychology, what we tend to focus on are the really pure cases, because you can imagine if somebody's they don't develop normal face recognition. Well, those developmental processes that went awry, they might also affect neighboring areas. Like I told you, a lot of these people have navigational troubles. And there's good evidence that navigational mechanisms are close to face recognition mechanisms. We see them dissociating all the time. One can be good or bad at one, and the other is normal. And so that's why we think that they're functionally separate. But certainly many people have other sorts of developmental problems that come, as well as in acquired cases. You often, especially with lesions, you have a stroke. You can often knock out a lot of different areas at the same time.
Do you know in the two cases you've mentioned, if the friends of these people are aware of their problem and how's it
They are,
handled?
yeah. Edward's wife, for example, is well aware of it. And a lot of the prosopagnosic spouses often develop strategies to help them. Like, we had a guy here last Friday, 2 Fridays ago, whose business partner, he says, is just wonderful about sort of, they'll see somebody coming and they'll say, "Oh, hey, Barry, you remember Joan, And she really sort of carries him in these business interactions. He said, there's no way I could do it if she wasn't here with me. So people often develop means, and they notice it. I mean, yeah. And Edward mentions, for example, I told you that he's got problems reading emotions from the face too. His wife, I mean, maybe this isn't all that uncommon, but his wife says, you just miss all kinds of, emotional expressions making. But I need to come up with a better example than that, maybe.
What about the 16-year-old? What about
Sorry?
the 16-year-old?
Oh yeah, there's no doubt about it. I mean, his mom's noticed. What she really notices, he can recognize her. I mean, in the house, there's 3 possible people. He can figure out who it is from other information. But she just notices that he's a lot more withdrawn, and he just doesn't want to engage in social activities in the same way that he used to before, just because it's just kind of it's a puzzle. It's just chaos to him.
But are the school kids aware of his problem?
He's told some. He hasn't told others. The problem with this, some people are quite sympathetic, but you tell people this often, and people just don't get it. They say, "Well, your eyes are, your eyes are fine, right? So how could you not recognize faces?" They don't realize that, half our brain is processing visual information. Yeah.
What about some of the other disorders in terms of even autism or Asperger's, some of the disorders where the social cues aren't seen? Have you seen any studies that link facial recognition to some of those? Has anyone taken a look at some of the autistic and Asperger's cases?
Yeah.
And
Seeing if they have
facial
face.
yeah, to see if
Yeah, there's no doubt that a lot of people with autism spectrum disorders have face perception problems, and I suspect in some of these cases, maybe that's all they have even, and they're just being called. I mean, we don't know what autism is,
Right.
and some of the people who I work with have been called. They've been told that they have Asperger's syndrome, but I suspect it might simply be, face perception problems. They're just not picking up on these signals. So it's not that they don't have normal social cognition. They think about sort of social interaction the same way you and I are. They just aren't getting that information. Some of the evidence one study I saw said that 30% of people with Asperger's syndrome have face perception problems. But they use pretty crude measures, so we just don't have a good feel for it yet. Yeah.
Have you looked at recognition of somebody's voice? So in other words, if somebody that is prosopagnosic is looking at speaks,
Right.
are they there?
I haven't looked at it. I mean, that's what they often use that. The interesting question might be, are they even better than you and I are at that? But we don't know. Yeah.
And connected to that, I was going to ask if you'd known of any studies where they look to see if the confusion over faces interfered with the other cues. I had an experience where I saw guys I knew I was going to see these guys I hadn't seen in 20 years, and the one guy's put on a bunch of weight, and I absolutely didn't recognize him until I was sitting in the car behind him when I couldn't see his face but could hear his voice. Came right to me, which I suppose is not unusual, but I just wondered if that same sort of a thing where the confusion that they feel over faces interferes with other cues.
Right, they should just close their eyes, right?
Well,
I mean, no,
should be that
maybe,
easy,
you know.
But
No, nobody's looked at that. I mean, we're still at a fairly elementary level in terms of understanding this, so we haven't gotten to look at all these sort of interesting questions that, I mean, there's a lot of things we can do. Yeah?
The people that can't recognize objects, they actually do not understand what the object is for? Do they understand the function of the object? Can they figure out that would just
Sometimes when you have people who have really severe object agnosia, you ask them, you say, what is this? They'll look at it, they don't have a clue what it is, but they find their hands sort of carrying out the action that you would do with it. And we think there's a pretty strong evidence now that there's what people call the two visual systems hypothesis, that there's one visual system that we use for action. So when I reach out to this bottle here, that visual system's working, and the visual system that I use for perception, just to know what that bottle looks like, actually is playing no role at all in my reaching out. So when you're seeing something, it's really not helping you pick something up, which is a really strange idea, but there seems to be this early separation in the visual system. And so there are people who can't see, say for example, a slot, what the orientation of a slot is. You'll ask them, what's the orientation of this slot? They'll say, I don't have a clue. Then you'll give them a piece of paper and say, stick this through the slot. They'll stick it through the slot without any problem. And you'll say, how'd you do that? And they'll say, I don't know how I did that, you know. And then there are other people who can see the orientation of the slot perfectly well, but just can't stick anything through there at the right orientation. And so we do see people, like what I'm saying, their action system knows what to do. They see a bottle, they want to pick it up, but you ask them what it is, they can't tell you. Sometimes they'll figure it out from what their hand's doing. They'll say, oh, that must be a bottle.
It almost sounds like a split brain kind of study.
It's just dissociating different parts of it. I mean, split brains is just one way to dissociate different mechanisms.
Does that have anything to do with like getting older?
You're obsessing on this today.
I mean, it's a big joke in my house is the Wisma Watson, the whatchamacallit, because you know what it is, you used it 1,001 times, but the name of that particular object just doesn't come to focus, and it's like really little things. And we play this little game in my house. My husband goes, looks like, sounds like, you know. But is that part of that, or is something getting older, or just?
Are you asking me when people get older, they have more trouble naming objects?
Yeah.
I don't have any data on it myself, but not lab data. But yeah, I think as you get older, it's more difficult to name things. Yeah, no doubt about it. Yeah.
What about how some of the, I don't remember what it's called, but the idea that you touch something and you see a color, or you...
synesthesia.
Taste it, yeah. Does that play in a role? I mean, we're talking about the same systems in there that are causing that change to what we're talking about with facial recognition. I don't know, there's so many questions that keep coming up, and links across the...
We don't have any reason to think that prosopagnosics are more likely to be synesthetics than other people, but so what she's talking about there, often people will have these, let's say they see a particular letter. Well, they always see that letter, say F. They always see F as yellow. They always see G as blue. And these are very consistent. And you can run tasks where, let's say you've got a bunch of letters on a screen. Now, if I tell you find the F in there, you and I, it takes a long time. We're searching all around. We do this with people who have synesthesia. You say find the F. They see it right away because it's a separate color than everything else. And so there's really good evidence that it's for real. Now, there's no connection to face recognition, but I've heard of synesthesia at sort of object face levels in terms of processing. What I mean by this, there was a woman, I don't know if this is real, but a friend of mine who studies synesthesia, he was in contact with this woman in Australia who says, you know, the way that I tell my shampoo and my conditioner apart when I'm in the shower is one's got one face, one has another. So most people have these real simple associations between a letter and a color, things like that. Well, she's got it at a higher level. She sees a particular object shape that evokes a face for her. And so So yeah, it's pretty crazy. Yeah.
When you do these contradicting studies or just multiple studies, do you hear back from the people who hypothesis those were?
When they were your reviewers.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah. You hear from reviewers, and I mean it's a real small community, So, and I mean there's science can be kind of bitter. People don't like each other a lot, and everybody's got a good reason why you didn't do it quite right if you've got data against their hypothesis. So yeah, I see these people and I'll hear from them. Yeah.
What about chimpanzees and facial recognition with chimpanzees and we've heard a lot about kind of connecting the neurons and some of the transgenic things they're doing. Obviously, we can't do them with people, but in terms of chimpanzees and facial recognition, and then being able to take that a step farther in the future.
Right.
Has
I don't have too much to tell you on that. There hasn't been a whole lot done. There's a little work going on down at the Primate Center at Emory, and they've shown that chimps are quite a bit better with upright faces than they are with inverted faces. Upright chimp and inverted chimp faces. So there seems to be something at least qualitatively similar to in chimps is what's going on for us, but we don't know all that much about it. A lot of the early evidence on face recognition that faces are processed by specialized systems comes from work in monkeys, and because they were doing single cell recordings where they go in there and record from just one neuron at a time. And this is in the late 60s. This was work actually done here at Harvard where, in the 50s and 60s, Hubel and Wiesel, I don't know if they've talked about them, but they were they were the most important neuroscientists at the time. And what they were doing was they were going in and recording from cat brains and finding what, in the early parts of the visual system, what it is that neurons respond to. And they were responding to simple things like lines and, 2 bars and things like that. Well, Charles Gross, who was here at Harvard, he just stuck his neuron way forward in the brain. And he just tried to see what it was that those neurons would respond to. And they just happened to luck into finding out that they respond to faces because somebody walked up in front while the monkey had the neuron in its brain, and the neuron started firing like crazy. And so they realized, well, this neuron appears to respond to faces. And so we know in the monkey where a lot of this stuff goes on and how these neurons respond, but you just can't, you can only do so much with them. That's not like people. So anything else? Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much.